Hi, I'm Greg Scott with Canada History Society, and I'm very pleased to be here today with Dr. Barry Gough. And we're going to talk about some of the books that he's written, and we're going to talk a little bit about maritime history on the Pacific Northwest coast and a few other items. So let me start off by introducing Barry, and maybe Barry, you could just give us a little bit of your background.
Well, Greg, thank you very much for this. I'm delighted that we can talk about our favorite subject of Canadian history. It's a living presence for me. Victoria is my hometown, has been, but I spent a lot of time in the United States, in England, in London and Cambridge particularly, but also in Waterloo, Ontario, where I was a professor at Wilfred Laurier University for 33 years. But I think it was the day after I retired there that I got on the next plane and came home to my old home port of Victoria. And I live in my family's house in South Saanich. And it's a very wonderful place. It's full of memories and full of archives and full of books. And so it's one of the more favored parts of the world, certainly one of the more favored parts of Canada. But I was educated here, public schools, not private schools, University of Victoria, University of British Columbia, then master's work at the University of Montana, on to King's College London and the Institute of Historical Research to train as a historian in Imperial and Commonwealth and naval history. And then after that, I became an associate professor at Western Washington University and established the Canadian Studies program there in the Cross-Border Institute. And then back to Canada in the height of the Vietnam War in refugee status, and fetched up at wonderful Waterloo and Kitchener, where I was a professor at Wilfred Laurier University for a very long period of time and developed the Canadian Studies program there. But it has been a good life. I've been blessed with good people to work with, wonderful libraries, support from a number of agencies and colleagues, and that's briefly it, Greg. The place where we're having this interview is Craig Darragh Castle, which at one time was the school board's headquarters, and my dad was superintendent of schools for Greater Victoria, and this was his office. And I often boasted I was the only young man in Canada whose father worked and ran a castle. So it's part of my heritage and part of the fun of being here.
So you've come home in so many ways.
I have indeed. Yes, it's great. Thank you.
Well, you've got a new book out about Meares Island, but not just the island. It's about a whole process that took place from the first contact between some of the European explorers and the indigenous people. And I'd like to ask you some questions about that in particular to begin with. And one of the comments you make in the book is that you refer to Britain's acquisition of its Pacific Northwest territories through treaty rather than conquest, or doctrine of discovery. Could you explain what the differences are and what difference it makes?
Well, the doctrine of discovery was not a British or English term. Queen Elizabeth I refused to accept the Spanish and Portuguese pretensions of a doctrine of discovery. And you'll remember by the Treaty of Tordesillas, they divided the world between the two of them. When Drake was sent out to the northwest coast of Nova Albion, he was to occupy and make a claim at a place which had not previously been occupied by the Spanish on the west coast. So the doctrine of discovery does not apply. It may have applied to French claims if they were inherited from the Spanish or the Portuguese, but it does not obtain here. The Columbia country, or the Oregon district, was claimed by both the United States and the United Kingdom, but it wasn't until the treaty between the two powers, which was in 1846, that the United Kingdom acquired the treaty, or the base sovereignty of the area from the 49th parallel to Russian America. Vancouver Island happily remained in British control. The Gulf Islands were up for grabs. Those were unusual places which were little known and undersurveyed at the time. So there are several ways of acquiring sovereignty, but establishing it by treaty is the definitive way. We never owned the title to Oregon. We never owned the title to the Kamloops area or to Fort Vancouver. Those were claimed areas of places which the British and the Hudson Bay Company might have occupied, but they didn't own the sovereign treaty to them. That was acquired by international treaty.
Okay, excellent. One of the salient themes of your book is your relationship with Woodward and Jack Woodward.
Yes.
And what started this whole process about Mears Island and the Clayoquot Sound protests from the 1980s.
Yes.
Could you expand a little bit about, it's great in your book how you describe your first contact and how you guys started to work together on this whole issue.
Yes, I got this phone call out of the blue. I think I was told by a neighbor to go to the phone box at Mansfield, Ontario, because a fellow from British Columbia was phoning me, and it turned out to be Jack Woodward. I didn't know who Jack Woodward was. I learned subsequently that he was writing this famous compilation called Native Law, and that he was the #1 Indian lawyer, as they say, and they're still called Indian lawyers. He and the Rosenberg cousins, who operated out of False Creek, Vancouver, were putting together a team of experts. They needed anthropologists, archaeologists, silviculture types, burial specialists, soil and gravel experts, but they needed somebody to do the colonial history. They needed somebody who is a historian, didn't necessarily have to deal with any oral interviews, but they wanted a specific background treatise on the colonial history of Vancouver Island in particular, with any references specifically to Mears Island, including such things as the establishment of the Christie Indian School and the laying down of the surveys. They wanted to know about the Spanish explorers, the British explorers who'd come there, the maps and cartography that developed from that. And Jack says, you've got 3 years to do this, but we want you to leave no stone unturned. And you know the British archives better than anybody else we can find because of your work there and several books on the subject, especially Gunboat Frontier. And so we want you to write this dossier. So this puzzled me because I'd never done contract history before. But I thought this is a new challenge, and when somebody presents a new challenge to you, and it sounds exciting, and it's got important results down the road. The stakes on this were huge, and we can talk about those if you wish. But you know, who is going to control Mears Island becomes a vitally important subject in the whole history of Aboriginal law in British Columbia and Canada. So I agreed to do this with Jack. Subsequently, the correspondence passed back and forth between False Creek and Waterloo, Ontario, and we got everything lined up. I did some research trips to Ottawa, to London, England, National Maritime Museum, the Hydrographic Record Office, and those kinds of places that had the secret stories. So the dossier was presented with the others when the case came in 1993. And at this point in time, the British Columbia consideration of the rights of Aboriginals to land was simply said that all the lands of British Columbia belong to all the people. But this was a different kind of story. This was cutting into that general argument. And as the documentation and my report began to be read, And I learned this later from one of the opposing lawyers who was working for the Crown in the right of British Columbia. He said it was my report that convinced them that they could no longer sustain this argument that all the lands of British Columbia belong to all British Columbians. So it was a breakthrough. It was a threshold document in that history. But jumping forward to the present, I sat on that trunk of documents for the longest time, and then I thought to myself, this is too good of a story to let remain silent. And as I think storytelling is part of writing history, I set to the task of telling of that brief encounter by phone, what it led to, my travels, all my background work on, and all the interesting stories of Tofino and Clayoquot Sound and Mears Island. You know, the seas, the footprints in the seas don't tell any stories. You've got to find those stories, like the destruction of the Tonquin. You've got to find that from other sources, or when the Spanish were there, or when John Mears, the famous explorer, in his wonderful description of Wickaninnish and the people living at Clayoquot Sound. He's been greatly reviled, but his description of Mears Island and the people there is a living presence. And I've got to write more about that because he really brings to life. That was the first ethnography, really, of these wonderful people at that point in time. But the book itself is stacked like James Michener would have done. And I think you picked this up in your comment, that it tells it as a layer from time immemorial to Cook's arrival, to Mears's arrival, to the American gun runners. They're arriving with all sorts of things and supplies, and then right through from that, right through to the colonial period, and then right up to the court case, and then beyond, right in through to the fight for the forest, the war for the woods, the war in the woods, call it what you will, right up to Fairy Creek. And so it's a telescopic history in just under 300 pages right from the beginning to the present. And I think it's the most current book in that sense that I've ever written.
Well,
it resonated with me that I had to get right to the present story, and to expose some of the government practices, as a matter of fact.
Oh, and to your point about Fairy Creek too, it's absolutely relevant today.
Yes.
And ongoing. Now you started writing this book about the land and the waters of the renowned sea otter chief Wickaninnish. You know, he's certainly featured throughout the early interaction of the Europeans and the indigenous people. But you also stated that he was a person of tremendous commercial acumen. And that's one of the themes that not only this book, but quite a few of your books, you talk about the commercial side of things, and Wickaninnish seem to have a focus on that. Could you sort of expand on that?
Thank you for picking up that point. I've always thought that commerce drives history. It's not necessarily the secretaries of state or the prime ministers who rule things and get things done, but they take advice from those people who work on the commercial and industrial side of things in order to profit and engage or harvest or whatever you wish to call it, or exploit resources, or feed people, or house people, as in the timbers of Mears Island, or the fish that would come out of that area. And long ago, I was taught by the great John S. Galbraith of UCLA, who was my external examiner for my PhD at the University of London, that it was the commerce and commercial connections in our world that drive us. And I'm very mindful of the fact that most historians pay so little to the commercial drive that pushes us forward one way or another. Because if we don't have commerce, and we don't have resources, and we don't have fuels, the world will dry up very, very quickly. So commerce is the thing. So John Mears was there in search of the sea otter. His desire was to trade with Wickaninnish, take as many sea otter pelts. They were the ermine of Asia, the most beautiful of all the pelts, 4 or 5 feet long, beautiful, lustrous fur, and they were the ermine of Asia. They were used to decorate the capes, the edges of the capes of the great Manchus, and the great potentates of East Asia. And so they were traded to Canton or to Macau. And Mears was one of the earliest in this business. He'd come all the way from India first, and then he used Canton, or Guangzhou as it's now called, as his base of operations. And he amalgamated with other traders, and one of them, James Colnett, gets caught at Nootka in the Nootka crisis, and that leads almost to war. That's another chapter in our West Coast history that needs more exploration. But he's pressing the necessity of having better access to the water. So this brings the Royal Navy to come and survey, because the good charts are the harbingers of commerce, and you need pilots, or sailing directions as we call them, to be able to sail safely. And the west coast of Vancouver Island is a graveyard of horror stories for shipping, as you know. Mm-hmm. So Mears opens this up, and he and the others, like Colnett, they do it wonderfully. Going to the Wickaninnish side of things, there's some considerable doubt and discussion as to whether or not he just harvested the resources or he exploited them as much as he could. This brings up the question, touchy, of the ethics of exploiting local resources or harvesting local resources. And although it is said that, the First Nations lived harmoniously with the land and the resources, there is beyond shadow of doubt that when the sea otter traders came into their realm, they sailed from perhaps Nia Bay, or came down from Haida Gwaii or Kukwat or some other location and came into Clayoquot Sound, they would take away as many of the sea otter pelts as had been prepared by Wickaninnish and company. When the Americans come, and they're the best of the Yankee traders, they bring arms and ammunition. They bring black powder and muskets. And Wickaninnish becomes the gun runner. And he's selling his goodies to the people on the east side of Vancouver Island, and they're drifting throughout the inland passage there. So interesting story there about gun running.
Yeah, and just the commercial side, which
yes.
we'll touch on a little bit more later. Nothing really distinguishes the original inhabitants from those who came to live among them in the modern period than the difference in how history was recorded. And as you already touched on, Native history is mainly oral history, yes, as opposed to, and as you said with Mears, great yes. example, how there's your first really substantial concrete view of how the people lived.
Yes.
So how difficult is it for a historian to dig through these things, and how much can you take the oral history and use it, or how restrictive is it?
It stands by itself. It is a history, and lots of legends were recorded by distinguished ethnographers, Sapir, Swadesh, Colpert, to give you 3 names, about Clayoquot Sound, and they're wonderful testimonies of the ideas and the legends and the tales, heroic and non-heroic, related to the seas, the sea gods, the life of whaling, and so forth. These are important testimonials. But as chronology for these people seemed to not go beyond the seasons, and they lived in an annual round, which was important to their sustenance. For example, they had to put enough salted or dried salmon up to last them through the winter. Otherwise, they would be in a very difficult circumstance. The other thing in terms of chronology is that the families were linked matrilineally and patrilineally, and Wickaninnish was the second of importance to Maquinna, who was at Nootka. But, and here I get this out of a document from 1837, written by a Royal Navy explorer, he finds in asking Maquinna who's first, Maquinna at Nootka says, "Oh no, Wickaninnish is now the most powerful chief. We recognize him as our number one."
Quite politics.
So this, how would I be able to determine how Wickaninnish succeeded Maquinna? Only through that report of that naval officer of 1837. So bingo, that to me was really an important testimonial that the Wickaninnish, if I were to ask Wickaninnish in 1837 how did he stand on this, he might say, well, I'm the most powerful chief, but you know, when you get it being authenticated by the person who used to be the most powerful chief, then, as I say, bingo, you've got a definite proof there that these things are shifting. And then we get to such things as the famous Clayoquot War of 1855, which is the last Indian war, quote unquote Indian war, in which Indians, or tribes and peoples, they're all Nuu-chah-nulth. Don't get me wrong, they're all Nuu-chah-nulth people, but they're waging war against one another. And that's described in the book. We don't need to get into that now, but that is an indication that they, in the histories that they have subsequently written by Peter Webster as one of the very better ones of them, date it to 1855, as did Clopert in his important anthropology study. So the chronology begins to become more certain as we get into modern times.
Yeah, well, again, it's, you know, always a bone of contention. Now, talking about the warfare, Clayoquot declared war on the Kelsimat.
Yes.
And took Opasat. And so that, what you're speculating here, it seems like, is that there was a little bit of potentially continual warfare, not every year or not every decade, but that was sort of a state of affairs that erupted constantly.
That's right. The Clayoquot are now dominant in Opasat and in Meares Island, and have been for a very long time. But I found out from the anthropological studies that they'd come out of Kennedy Lake. Kennedy Lake is the lake, the big lake that's beside Highway 4 as you drive west to the Pacific Rim Highway. And they had a village where the river from Kennedy Lake flows into Clayoquot Sound, but they wanted more access to salmon for the population and for the food storage. So they waged a war with the Kelsimat and removed them from the location. Mactosis, I believe, is the name of the place, or near to Mactosis. And so the Kelsimat were driven from that location and became more attached to the Ahousaht, who were not the closest of allies with the Clayoquot. And you'll see in a map in the book how the lines are divided. And scholars who are interested in this are fascinated with the idea that First Nations were interested in controlling sea areas as well as controlling land areas. And here we have a very good example of the Clayoquot expanding into a water-bearing area, a food-bearing area of water, and expanding it that way.
Yeah. Well, for the resources. Now, one of the things you point out in your book, which you know, sometimes when you're reading something, the light comes on, and you think, yeah, you know, I always knew this, but this is a great perspective because it actually explains a lot of things, and that's the arrival of Cook. And you describe this as a watershed moment, but the actual terms used in the book are the Industrial Revolution sailed into Nootka Sound with Cook. And there's the eye-opening moment where the world has changed for them.
I owe that to Dan George, who once said that the Industrial Revolution had crossed the Atlantic under sail. What he meant, and what I mean here, is that all of a sudden arms and ammunition, iron, copper, metal products, forging techniques, distilling techniques, certain things related to food production, but especially to goods and services which the Industrial Revolution was bringing. And not least, and this is woolen items, cloth, rope. It's not that these things could not be produced by indigenous persons, but they were on a totally different scale. The sail on one of James Cook's vessels is made is a canvas sail. The canvas was introduced to Wickaninnish, and he wanted to learn to sail. And an article was written by Judge Howie on this subject about the introduction of sail. So all of these things are related to what's happening in Europe and in the eastern United States. And it's coming of a new material world and a new processing world. And so the exchange goes on. The industrial commodities, including woolens, cloths, copper sheets, and so forth, are traded. Guns and ammunition also are traded, and in exchange, the natural resources come. Mears takes the first shipload of spars to China and sells timbers for shipbuilding and construction purposes there. That becomes a huge business for British Columbia, still is. I've talked about the sea otter. That's another thing, which was a product which was exchanged for industrial goods and commodities. So what's happening here is a symbiotic relationship and the demands are changing. The indigenous persons, their economies are dramatically being changed, dependent upon European or American arrivals for this and that. Some would say, perhaps a little caustically, that indigenous economies were being subverted. Fair enough. Undoubtedly, they were being changed. And, I look back on our own last 10 years in which we've modified the way we communicate. And there's another revolution. I'm sure that a similar sort of revolution was going on at that time in that place.
Yeah, well, that's a very good point about communication these days.
Isn't that so?
With the internet and social media
yes.
and everything else.
That's right.
Okay, again, in your book, you allude to the native view of property and how they assigned and regulated materials, items, and land, and their view of land. Could you expand a little bit upon the native view of how they looked at all of these issues?
Well, the land was, of course, a spiritual value to them as their home base, their home territories. The adjacent waters were certainly related to this. They used the timbers to make their magnificent houses. They were burial places as well. So there was an integration of the First Nations there with the land and the seas. Everything was inclusive. There was no ethic of land control. It was just, in essence, theirs. But they had a fine idea of property. And James Cook, when he arrives in 1778, he said he'd never in all his 3 voyages in the Pacific met a people who had such a high-minded idea of property as these people do. And he said every blade of grass they wanted compensation for. Now, when the first encounter occurs with Cook, there's not this commercial exchange, but they realize, the indigenous people realize after a while that, you know, there's something to be made here, and they should pay for it. You know, if they're going to have grass for their goats and their cattle on board ship, no, this is a McCook. This is a, you know, this is an exchange, right? So they were good about a concept of ownership of what was on the land. As to boundaries, they tended to use mountains as their perimeters, and in terms of navigation, Meares Island. The name of Meares Island, when translated, says, "We steer by the mountains." And Meares Island is a prominent island, as you know, and there's Mount Colnett and Lone Cone. Those are the two large mountains there. And they were beacons, if you will, or points of reference is a better way of putting it, so that if you were sailing from offshore, you would be able to see them first, and you would line them up in a certain way, and then you would make one of the two entrances into Clayoquot Sound by that way. So they had a concept of land in terms of how to navigate, how to get home. And it's important because it's an extraordinarily stormy coast and lots of fog there from time to time and other difficulties. The currents and tidal rips going through Port Cox or Tofino Harbor are something to be only experienced, I tell you, a near-run thing.
Sounds like there's another book there.
Wow.
Now, we discussed earlier the doctrine of discovery, and I know in your book on Juan de Fuca, or the book called Juan de Fuca, you touch a little bit on the underappreciation we have for Spanish explorers, and how we sort of go through and maybe don't discuss them that much. And when you were over at the conference in Spain, how thrilled everybody was when you were talking about all the achievements of the Spanish over here. From your knowledge and your research and all your reading and all the people you've had contact with over the years, do you think, or is there any evidence that before the Spanish and the English and the Russians, perhaps there was any other contact with anybody else, as an example, maybe the Chinese?
Yes. First of all, before I get to the Chinese, we do know that the Japanese sea drifters came across. These people would be fishing in Japan waters, and maybe there was a big storm came up. And then, unable to use their masts and rigging or paddles, or oars, they drifted across. So there's a wonderful book called The Shogun's Reluctant Ambassadors. The Shogun's Reluctant Ambassadors. It talks about the sea drifters, and that's another story. But more to the point, in 458 AD, it is mooted that a vessel arrived off the coast and set into an area called the land of Fusang. And the land of Fusang, if you look at Henry Roberts's chart of the North Pacific, which was done in 1788, and it's on the front of Margaret Ormsby's History of British Columbia, incidentally, the land of Fusang was the land of the Chinese navigators. And they had come, and it's reputed that the texts of these discoveries were recorded in Chinese documents of the day. And the French took an interest in this in the 19th century. The Germans did as well. The American historian Justin Windsor did as well. A person called Tate, Meares Tate, wrote a book on this, and it's a famous Spanish colonial scholar by the name of Chapman at UC Berkeley devotes a whole chapter to the land of Fusang and the voyages of the Chinese navigators, and he's convinced that they came. And that Fusang goes from British Columbia down to Mexico. And they have related the stories of various berries that existed in various trees and other circumstances of the geography that conform with the two reports that were taken back to China and edited and published. So it's quite likely that this is a very good possibility, I should say, that this existed. And several books have been written on it, and I've written a long essay on it, which is not published yet. But it's more gripping when I get to Francis Drake and I get to more tactile things where I've got actual documents and actual ships that I can exploit and tell that story about Nova Albion and Drake's Bay, which I'm working on now. But yes, the land of Fusang of the ancient Chinese navigators, that is a tale. And as to going back to First Nations concepts of time, they say they've been here from time immemorial, or time out of mind, perhaps. John Dewhurst and Folan, working for Ottawa, did their archaeological digs at Nootka Sound, and they said 10,000 BC is approximately the date of actual arrival of First Nations, if you're using archaeological evidence as the statement of this. So it all mixes together. It all is it's a tremendous panorama. And let me add this. In terms of Canada and eastern United States, very little of this ever gets told. And it's one of the tragedies of the Canadian experience, that not enough attention has been paid to this very dramatic last final division of the continent that occurs on our coasts here, because it completes the Canadian project, or the possibility of a Canadian project. And all this idea of connecting Asia and Japan, Korea, China, Singapore with Canada for trade, this all goes back to Mears, you see. It all goes back to Wick and Inish as the pathfinders. This is only a brief chapter. What I've written about in Possessing Mears Island is but a chapter in the larger history of Canada on the Pacific and its tremendous power and projection to East Asia.
Okay, so now that's really interesting, because you've written two other books about Alexander Mackenzie and Peter Pond.
Yes.
And about that whole discovery from, as you say, the East Coast, coming through, again, a commercial enterprise for the most part.
Absolutely.
And finding the way through that little pass between the Hudson Bay, the Arctic Basin, and then to the Pacific.
Messy portage.
So tell us a little bit about that, because again, in 1792, July 22nd, when Mackenzie came overland and marked that rock up, he was only a few weeks off of when Vancouver came through. So that, as you say, is the other side of it.
Well, Athabasca was the great fur-bearing beaver forest, and it lies to the west of Fort Chipewyan on Lake Athabasca. So this was the golden heartland which the fur traders were seeking. And as you say, they came across that little path, Methye Portage, which comes into Fort McMurray today. And there's a Peter Pond shopping center there, don't you know, and a school. But the Nor'westers were, of course, the great enemies of the old Hudson Bay Company, and they were the Canadians. They were coming from Montreal through the Great Lakes. They were great allies with the British Army and the indigenous people of the Great Lakes, and they were pushing their way west, but they were coming across, if I can use the term, the soft underbelly of the Hudson Bay Company trade, the Hudson Bay Company were accused of being sleeping by the bay, and that was absolutely true. And it wasn't until the Nor'westers came in there that the HBC was stirred from their solitude. And Peter Pond is a Yankee, Connecticut boy, but he's a brilliant fur trader, and he's also excellent in indigenous languages. He can speak Sioux. He goes out as an emissary to solve and broker a peace there after the War of the American Revolution. And then Mackenzie had been in the War of the American Revolution too. He was an emigre from from Scotland, very well educated, as I pointed out. But he goes as an understudy to Pond up in the Athabasca district. And Pond has this idea of linking up with the Russians at Cook Inlet. Oh, and Mackenzie gets this idea and jokingly says that he's going to go all the way to Moscow and link up with Tsarina Catherine, the Great. I don't know what Tsarina Catherine would have done with this Randy Scott, but I can only imagine. But this was the idea to complete a global commerce, and Mackenzie in his famous book describes the Canadian circumstances have been somewhat similar to those of the Russians. That is to say, we were people pushing towards the waterways and pushing towards commerce on the oceans and in the rivers, in this case the Pacific. So Mackenzie has this idea of a trans-Canada linkage, and nothing works perfectly to his way of thinking, but he does make that famous achievement, and Mackenzie's Rock is his memorial. But you mentioned Vancouver. I don't think the two of them knew that the other party was on the shore or on the land. It just happened to be a confluence of the circumstances of the continental trade on the one hand, and the search for the Northwest Passage and solving the problem with the Spanish on the other hand. And it happens to come at this far side of the world, you know. I mean, can you imagine these people working, the mariners working 18,000 sea miles from London, from Portsmouth? Or Mackenzie going across in a summer, one whole summer, from where Fort McMurray is today, or the Peace River is today, all the way over to the Pacific and then back with a small crew of about 9 people. No wonder he was exhausted when he finished his trip. But it's heroic stuff. It's very important. We're not supposed to tell old white boy's history here, but I'll tell you that had he not been so single-minded and to try to open up trade in the Pacific and to determine the western ramparts of Canada with a longitude and latitude, and that was a geographical finding that was his and his alone, to Pacific waterways. It would have taken a long time after that for it to prove it. Of course, Vancouver could have determined it by longitude and latitude, but not transcontinentally, as Mackenzie did. So there's a great stories of the fur trade still to be told.
Oh, and you've written them well. Those two books together, they complement each other so well, and they explain so much, because as you say, there's blank spots on the map, and over the years you're filling them all in.
One more thing to say, if I might. Mackenzie and Pond had very good relations with First Nations. Indeed, Mackenzie was married to a Chippewayan female, the Cat, and a son was born to them. She died rather young, sadly, and he went back to Scotland and lived in a baronial estate and remarried again. But they lived in close proximity and in a symbiotic relationship with their people, who guided them and helped them along the way. It's very important.
Yeah, good point. Now, you mentioned John Galbraith earlier, and how the merchant sector was far more important than the creation of official policy than by the statesmen and the bureaucrats in Whitehall. So again, touching on that point, it seems, and your original areas of study with imperialism and naval history, and it seems like that was really the driving force in Canada specifically, if not other places, behind a lot of the exploration and a lot of the expansion.
That's right. That's right. Well, even coal is part of this scenario too, because coal is discovered in Nanaimo in great quantities, and it, as James Douglas, the governor, said, coal was the great desideratum of the Pacific, because steam navigation was coming forward in the 1850s. And so the discovery of coal was advantageous to the making Esquimalt, the great naval base it did shortly thereafter. It became station headquarters in 1862. So steam navigation was changing the world. And so, you know, by the late 19th century, there were still some Royal Navy ships here that had sails, but those were only auxiliary purposes. Most of the ships were mastless and had their big boilers and were churning their propellers or their side wheelers. So it was a revolution. And of course, it made possible the coming of the railway too, because the railway was being run by steam, right? And coal.
And here's why we're here today.
And this is the Dunsmuir legacy. It's the great story.
When you're talking about the sea otters and the trade, again, it went both ways. And one of the biggest factors in sort of the return of the way of life for Aboriginal people along the coast here was when the sea otters did run out, and then suddenly the traders were not coming as much. And so there was this period, I think you called it, was it the Great Interlude or the
in-between time?
In-between times, yes.
Yes, it was the hardest part of the book to write. It was, I didn't seem to have the facts from the Indigenous side, except reports from the Royal Navy surveyors, or the Hudson Bay Company kept trade away from the Clayoquot Sound. They didn't want intruders there. There were a number of people who tried to trade there, but the HBC, because it had the monopoly of all commercial trade here on Vancouver Island under its Charter of Grant, it kept them out of there. So Clayoquot Sound is a bit of a backwater, and I've often wondered whether or not this was a good thing or not. Was it salutary that commerce was neglected by the Europeans there? Did it allow the First Nations there to enrich their own culture and deepen themselves and restore and retain their rights of political control and warfare? As I say, the last war occurs there in 1855 of all Vancouver Island and British Columbia. So it's a salutary period. But then, of course, the CPR steamships start coming in there. And that means that the First Nations can go away and engage in laboring activities, say gathering cranberries in Washington State, for instance, and then coming home. There's a photograph in the book that shows this occurring. So it gave First Nations mobility, and it gave them some wealth as well. The sealing trade to the Bering Sea was important to these people too, because the males were hired on as contracted sailors for the Victorious Sealing Company. And then when that trade stopped in 1903, the people at Clayoquot Sound were very upset because they'd lost their jobs. You know, so again, they're subject to international law and international rules and regulations. And but the story does come through. I do pinch it through until finally I get to the 20th century, where the modern world has encroached upon all Aboriginal British Columbia. And that was a good place, I think, to begin the final and the denouement of the book, which is dealing with the timber policies of the province of British Columbia and the forest licenses, the practices of the loggers, the changes of ethics, and the war for the woods.
Well, jumping ahead here a little bit, and taking up on that point and jumping ahead here a little bit, one of the things that you start the book with and sort of end the book off with is the reference to Mears Island as a garden.
Yeah.
And that seemed somewhere along the line, but maybe explain that a little bit, because it seemed like a very pivotal word.
Thank you. Thank you for pointing that out. It was Moses Martin who was the leader in the Moses Martin versus H.M. the Q et al. In the Mears Island case of 1985, who defined it as a garden. And they proclaimed it in a park in Tofino. And he said that we're going to have this as a tribal park. He didn't say which tribe, but he said it's going to be a tribal park. This is our garden. by which he meant not a garden for necessarily growing potatoes or rutabagas, but a garden of pleasure, of refreshment, of recourse to nature, a place for restoration. And one of the earliest uses of the school was as a place for rehabilitation of alcoholic and drug-addicted First Nations persons. So he was looking at the island as a garden, and gardens need to be cultivated. They don't need to be cut down. They don't need to be brutally destroyed and waterworks put in and fertilized and so forth. This, for him, it was a natural place which would be a garden not only for the three indigenous nations or tribes who had an interest in this, but others to come and see as well. So the forests had to be preserved under that rubric as a garden. Yes, that's right.
Yeah, and so that sort of was partially a cornerstone of the legal case too.
It is indeed. It is indeed, and all sorts of good documentation was brought forward by the other specialists who knew a lot about the indigenous use of the trees. I mean, the taking of the bark for the making of rope, for instance, the capacity of even cutting a canoe in a living forest tree, a cedar tree. And the old growth trees there are absolutely of mammoth size, and you can still go there and see the remnants of how they have been modified and changed. And it was out of this fight for the forest and the garden that the term culturally modified trees was born. That is born out of the Mears Island case, the culturally modified trees. And of course, the three nations that I'm talking about are not the only ones who have been culturally modifying trees, and they're not the only people in the world, but it entered the law books. And if you read Judge Seaton's or Judge Lambert's report on this from 1993, you see how resonant this was. And Judge Vickers picked up on this as well, and they got on the side, and it was a huge watershed in ecology. You know, we've had all sorts of racial Carsons writing books about this, but this was a signal case that brought this forward. Now, it's different from the Chilcotin case and some others, but it was within vision of most people of Vancouver Island, Vancouver, city of Vancouver, Nanaimo, Port Alberni, Courtenay, and so forth, that they would realize that this was a prospective place that we could leave alone. It brings up the question of, is it easier to save an island or is it easier to save a continental zone? Islands have their own definition. They're determined by high tide mark, so they're definitive. And so Mears Island could be saved as a garden because it was definitive. It's not easy to defend a watershed.
Yeah.
Now, how definitive is a watershed? You know? So I leave that thought with you, but Mears Island as a garden was specific and definitive, exact.
So again, one of the things you've touched on is arms and indigenous attacks against each other, but also potentially with some traders trading, it seems like more so American traders, trading arms to the indigenous people. Not only did it open up the interband warfare potentially to become much more deadly than it would have been before, but also some of the conflicts between the people and some of the ships coming along the shore.
Yes.
And all of a sudden this European advantage was gone in some cases.
That's true. That's true. The First Nations had the capacity to fight back in that regard. As to accuracy, we're not quite so sure, but it did send up warning signals. It did send up warning signals to be careful of going into Clayoquot Sound. And Robert Gray is one of these people who is very concerned about the arms buildup. And there's a big story within Possessing Mears Island about the building of the schooner Adventurer and what that led to. More important in terms of violence, of course, is the blowing up of John Jacob Astor's ship, the Tonquin, and the use of gunpowder to blow up the ship to keep it out of the hands and keep the cannon out of the hands of the First Nations, the Ahousa's, who were making the attack, and the Clayoquot as well. So yes, violence was occurring there. And there was the case of the Butterworth, another ship. There were incidents of this sort. Sadly, sometimes the evidence is only it's not supported. That is to say, it's a single example of a story of how things have worked themselves out, but it's not collaborated by another definitive story. Or one can be strong and the other one can be weak. A historian has to be very careful in these kinds of circumstances to make sure that the story is being portrayed is as accurate to the document as it possibly could, and not to go beyond the realms of reality in this, in telling a story that can't be documented. But the loss of the Tonquin is one of the most famous ship disasters in world history. It's a famous American story. It's not so well known in Canada, of course, because we don't pay attention to this kind of American history. But it happens in Clayoquot Sound, so it becomes an important part of Clayoquot Sound. And when the ship was blown up, hundreds of blankets were thrown into the air. And in Clayoquot Sound, these blankets were saved as trophies of a victory against an American ship. And I've got that as evidence in the book. This was how they, the showing of a blanket from the Tonquin was material evidence of the fact that the explosion occurred in their own waters, and secondly, that this was a trophy of war, of their success. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and much, not much the same, but another story is of the Boston with John Jewett.
The Boston story is another one.
Yeah, and then writing the book under because he wanted to tell his story, or because there was a lucrative contract there for publishing something back east.
Oh yeah, and John Kendrick and Koya in Haida Gwaii. There's a story I want to write up for sure.
Well, you're going to have to live to be about 300 to get to all the books you want to write.
I got time on my side.
The current struggle in historiography regarding military history, one point you touch on in your book is this battle between our confrontation between historians in the different academic institutions in the general academic world with historians. And how military and or naval history, for instance, sort of get dismissed. When we were talking earlier, you were talking about Vietnam, how that sort of gets sidelined whenever people start to get sensitive about the wars and
Yes.
the tragedies of the wars.
Yes.
But it's not necessarily a justified or fair approach for a lot of historians to try and whitewash that whole side of studying history.
That's right. I was lucky. I was involved with several societies which were interested in maritime history, including naval history, which is a part of it. And I was invited to teach at the University of Maine for several summers on naval history. And that was my introduction to teaching naval history. And then colleagues at Wilfred Laurier University accepted my proposal to teach a history of sea power from ancient times to the present in two semesters. So it was back to back, and it was riveting stuff, right from the beginning of when people got onto logs, right through to atomic and nuclear weaponry and the Polaris submarines. And that was, to me, a most eye-opener. And that's how I got involved in the writing the history of HMCS Haida, because I was lecturing at Canadian Forces College. The executive director of Haida said, we could use you on our board. And then I got on the board of HMCS Haida, and I discovered the board members didn't know anything about the history of the ship. So I said, all right, why don't I task some of my students at Laurier to write some chapters, and we'll do some research in the original documents. And battle ensign flying came out of that study and encounter. And so happily, when Sheila Copps was Minister of Heritage and History, she says, yes, we do need a Marine Discovery Center at Hamilton, and we're going to buy Haida from the Toronto Parks Board, and we're going to sail it across, and we're going to replate it, and then we're going to have her as exhibition number 1 in the National Historic Site in Hamilton. So that's how we saved the ship. But naval history is a wonderful way to open the study of all human history, because 6/7 of the world is water, and the use of the seas for commerce and military purposes, and the struggles on the seas for controlling trade and commerce and areas of the world is vitally related to the history of sea power. For instance, Quebec would not have fallen in 1759 had the Royal Navy not been there.
Your article on Saunders.
On Saunders. And James Wolfe adored Saunders because he helped him out so much. Canada would not have been saved in the War of the American Revolution without the Royal Navy's help. We would have not been able to keep the Americans away fully without the Navy in the War of 1812, although on the Great Lakes we didn't do so well. We would not have been able to sustain our interests here in British Columbia had not the Royal Navy chosen Esquimalt as its naval base, and that was my first book, my PhD thesis. So yeah, sea power was wonderful. As to colleagues, they were warm in appreciation of the breadth of their interest, but this only lasted as long as the Cold War. And when Fukuyama came along with the end of history, and everything went to a wave of history, and you could begin to see this in the American Historical Review in 2000, the year 2000, this changed the dynamic altogether. And post-colonial studies talking about the other, gender relations, of course, as well, and the new shift in these sorts of things meant that naval and military and air history was now in a new set of circumstances. Comes 2014 and the centenary of the origin of the First World War. There's a great revitalization of it. But we also have had outstanding colleagues. My colleague Terry Kopp at Wilfred Laurier University was one of the most outstanding military historians in Canada, and writing on the Second World War. So I had a good ally in that. And we had lots of students. The rooms were filled all the time, 60 seats every time. So that was a great tribute. And lots of students wrote theses under my direction, MA and PhD theses. And we had a good successor there in Roger Sarty, who's a great naval historian of Canada, as you know. So there was a legacy there as well.
Yeah, no, I remember in doing my undergrad degree at UBC, I took 2 courses in military conflict and military history, and they were full. They were full. And this was 3rd or 4th year, so usually you're down to 12, 15 students, and there was like 60 students. They were
yes.
A lot of interest.
Yes.
So you've written a lot of great books. I find them highly readable, highly educational, and just terrific books. What's the next one?
There are 2 of them. In no order of preparedness, but they're both coming towards a conclusion, and I'm looking for a publisher. And we'll find one, I'm sure, although then the first one that I'm going to talk to you about, I've been chopping it around. It's on Sir Francis Drake and Elizabeth I, who commissioned him to take this tremendous raiding expedition into the Pacific, leaving Plymouth in 1578, and arriving there and back in 2 years later, having circumnavigated the globe and brought back a hold full of silver and gold and pearls and 6 tons of cloves. And it's the beginning of the direct spice trade between the South Asian waters and England, and it's the forerunner of the East India Company, which becomes the greatest of the corporations. But in terms of empire and seamanship, it's an extraordinary story, because Drake arrives in 1579, in June, in Drake's Bay, and careens his ship in Drake's Estero, is there for a month, exchanges greetings and relationship with the local chief or heo, and proclaims that area for Elizabeth I. So it's the first claim to British Empire, or English Empire in America. It precedes Virginia, Massachusetts, and the rest. It's an extraordinary story. It's been mistold in the British Columbia context by Sam Balfe, who argued that Drake went to the Charlottes, Haida Gwaii, then came down through Cape Scott, came down through Seymour Narrows, don't you know, missed Race Rock, all the tidal rips off Quadra Island, dipsy-doodled through the Strait of Juan de Fuca, and then went south and then around the world. As I've written in Juan de Fuca Strait, he would have had to have 250 Yamaha outboard motors strapped to the transom of the Golden Hind if he were to do that little escapade that Balfe has described. It just did not happen. So mine is the true history of Nova Albion and the true history of Drake. British Columbians are not going to be so happy, because they would like to think that Drake came to here, but it's not true. So that's the first one. But the other one, which is, I've got a footnote or two still to write on it, is the unknown governor, Richard Blanchard. Now there's a case in which a barrister, Oxford and Cambridge trained, world traveler, because he'd been in India in fighting a war before he was appointed governor in London in 1849, is thrown to the wolves out here because James Douglas and the Hudson Bay Company rule everything, and they control everything. Every nickel and dime, every piece of property they own. And Blanchard is the new Victorian. He comes from a very wealthy banking family, railway family, coal baron family, and he comes out here and he sees what goes on, and he first reports home, say, the colony is not doing very well. And as his letters continue to go back to London, the more and more they become full of distress about how the Hudson Bay Company is taking all the land. And the individual settlers who are supposed to be awarded land on application and paying £1 an acre, they're sent to remote locations like Machosen and Souk, thank you very much. Or that little allotments, big allotments of 100 acres are given on a preferential basis to people who might want to live in Oak Bay or Shoal Bay, for example. And discovering that all the appointments are going to James Douglas and his friends and family. It's Greg, this is a story of intrigue and backsheesh, I think is the right term for it. It's a great story. Anyway, he suffers ill health and he goes home, and then he testifies to the British Parliament in the famous inquiry of 1857 where he tells all, and he's not the only one who tells all about the Hudson Bay Company, and it leads the Hudson Bay Company have to surrender its title to Vancouver Island, and it's paid off, of course, by the British government to satisfy the arrangements. I take the story right through to his interesting last years. He was a renowned yachtsman. He died blind in 1777 in London, England. He was a very, very wealthy man, great benefactor, well loved by the people who he knew there. And so these are backstories on something we've only got a glimmer of knowledge of. We've heard about Blanchard Street and the Blanchard building, but there's no island that's named after him, no mountain. All the mountains are named after Hudson Bay Company people, Tommy, Douglas, Work, Finlayson, you know, they're all HBC types, and old Blanchard gets shoveled off in the side. He's in the side currents of history. This is just exactly the stuff I love. Exactly the stuff I love.
Well, I think I've read just about all your books now, so you better hurry and get those outside. Now, we're actually approaching Christmas, but besides buying your new book, and I'm going to make this a little easier on you and say you can't choose your own books. If you were to give me the top 3 books about Canadian history that you would recommend people to read, what would they be?
George Colpitts wrote a book on the death of the Commons, about the end of the buffalo trade and its importance in the Canadian West. So that would be on my list. I would think the reprint of Charles Stacey's book on Quebec, which is with good notes by Donald Graves, one of our great historians, would be another one. Quebec, the Battle. I think that's an outstanding book. Let's see, closer to home or farther away. Sisters in the Ice is an interesting book about 2 ships, the San Roque and the Sister of Herschel Island, I think it's called, written by a Mr. MacDonald who owns the latter vessel. And they're both in Vancouver Harbor, but it's the history of Canada's interest in the Arctic waterways and Herschel Island, which is a whaling rendezvous place early in the 20th century. That's a good piece of work. So those are 3 of them.
Well, thank you very much. And Barry, I want to really thank you for your time and your insight and your new book. And Craig Derrick Castle for hosting this wonderful session. And hopefully we can get together again sometime soon and explore some of the other issues and your new books.
It would be a pleasure to be together with you again, Greg.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. I love history. I love biography, so getting a chance to talk about these things is a thrill for me. So thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you very much.